Next to me now is the grave of probably the most controversial figure in the entire Mountain Meadows Massacre, John D. Lee. And he's controversial because a lot of people, myself included, believe that he was executed in a sort of chain of events that would let everybody else who was involved in it off the hook. John D. Lee was born on the East Coast, and he was active in the Black Hawk War there. So during this time, he gained an understanding of the Native American and how they thought. He was an early convert to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and he began believing that the Native Americans were the tribe of the Lamanites. He believed that they were the same people, the Mormons and the Indian. And so he believed that not only was it his duty to teach them, but he was a part of them. And so when he arrived in Utah with Brigham Young, he was sent down with men like William H. Dame, Jacob Hamblin, and Isaac Height to begin proselytizing and setting up communities in southern Utah and teaching the Navajo and the Paiute. And he was very close with men like Walkara and Kanosh. And when the immigrant train was heading through, there was this widespread belief that they had poisoned the well nearby, although we now believe, as I mentioned earlier, that this could have been a cattle with anthrax, although at least 2 Paiutes died and at least 1 young boy as a part of the settlement. So he was one of the men who believed that they needed to take action. But he knew that if the Mormons did it, if white men did this, then the government would come in and wipe them out. So he attempted on September 3rd to try to send a message to the Paiutes. And this was a meeting that he had with Isaac Height, and he admits this himself, that he met with Isaac Height, one of the leaders of the Iron County Mormon militia, to incite the Paiute. At the time of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, the capital of Utah wasn't 200 miles north, it was just over there. And Kanosh, which is the city that the Paiute people under Chief Kanosh, was just a few miles back there. It was a Paiute tribe. And as the settlers were coming in from Arkansas, they came into the capital here and tried doing some trading, but because Brigham Young was kind of whipping them into a state of war, or a war readiness state, they said no. He forbade people, Mormons, from trading with settlers passing through, even though their hope was just to make it to California. And at the same time, there was a young boy, I believe he was 12 or 13, and he died mysteriously after drinking from a well that was located near the camp of the settlers. Nowadays, we think he probably died of smallpox or anthrax or whatever, and so they buried him. And they dug him up just a few years ago to check to see if there were any spores. They didn't find any, but the Kanosh and his band of Paiutes located nearby leads me to think that the Mormon battalion probably was working with Kanosh at some point and brought them down to the Mountain Meadows area, because they said that it was about 50 Mormons and 200-something Paiutes, and they would have been led by John D. Lee, and the grave of the man that we visited today in Parowan, who did not ever face any punishment. In fact, the only Mormon to be executed was John D. Lee, and that was years later. One of the stories of Mountain Meadows Massacre that ties in with the negative attitudes that the local people had towards the party passing through Utah was the death of Proctor Hancock, who was about 12 or 13 when he died. And the story goes that a man had recently moved in from Texas with his cattle, and this is a common carrier of anthrax, a disease that wasn't too well known in Utah at the time. And so when a couple of these cattle die at the local spring in the town of Kanosh at the Corn Creek Indian Reservation, Proctor Hancock was skinning the cattle. And it's said that he had a sore on his eye, and he went to go rub his eye after trying to salvage the hides, and he almost didn't even make it home. His face was swelling up, and he sat down in the fetal position and passed away from the anthrax. And they later dug his grave up because the story was, you know, the immigrants from the Arkansas wagon train poisoned the well that killed the cattle and killed a couple of young boys, or a couple of people in town who drank from the well, and Proctor Hancock. And they dug his grave up because all the symptoms matched anthrax, and they wanted to see if he had spores on his body. When they dug in, if you want to bring the camera in a little closer, the backhoe struck the top of his gravestone and cracked it. And he still has a gravestone in the cemetery in the town of Fillmore, but this would have actually been his original one, and it was buried pretty deep. They tried to dig him up with a backhoe, and this is what they found. And so this is probably one of the rumors that began the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Behind me now is the Great Basin National Park, and right over to my left is the community of Kanosh. And it was here in the first week of September that the Arkansas wagon train arrived in what was called at the time the Corn Creek Indian Community. And this Indian community was led by a brother of the famous chief Walkara, a peaceful chief known as Kanosh, who led the Pavant Ute. or the Pavant Paiute. And the story goes, at least at the time, that a lot of people suspected Chief Kanosh of supporting and rallying his troops to join in the massacre. These would have been the roughly 100 Paiute that were seen, although a lot of people reject this idea because Chief Kanosh himself was a peace chief. He didn't really have any business with war. But what leads me to question his involvement is the fact that he was very good with Brigham Young, and around the time that the Arkansas wagon train was trying to make it down to Corn Creek Indian Community, a lot of rumors of them poisoning the wells followed them up from Fillmore. And when they arrived here, just a few days before, Kanosh rode up to Salt Lake City to talk to Brigham Young about strategies for the upcoming Utah War. So, we don't really know Kanosh's movements after this, and it's very likely that he would have had a short conversation with Brigham Young, who later wrote to the church leaders in South Utah saying, "Don't attack the wagon train, but the Indians, we suspect, will do as they please," which was a pretty clear message. He could have talked to Kanosh or somebody else from the Corn Creek community and said, "Do what you want to this community, do what you want to this Arkansas train, and we will kind of stand back and watch." So it's a theory with no real evidence to back it up, really. His band of Paiutes, which was in the Corn Creek area, never took part in the war against the Mormons. And this is one of the few bands that never actually took part in this war. It was called the Black Hawk War, which was led by another one of his family members, Chief Black Hawk, or he was also called Chief Arpine. These were all members of the Timpanogos tribe, and this war later became characterized by a brutal mass massacre by the Mormons against the Timpanogos. If you identified as a Timpanogos, you would be killed on the spot. And hundreds of them were killed, I believe, at one specific fort. I think it was called the Fort Utah Massacre, including the beheading of Chief Old Elk. And this is one of the defining moments of Mormon history in the Indian Wars. And Chief Kanosh, it is believed, although there's no evidence to support it, that he recruited the Native Americans that were involved in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And if you understand the Mountain Meadows Massacre, it's one of the most controversial moments in frontier history, but the Mormons had started whipping up into a state of a frenzy, a war, and Brigham Young told them that the United States Army was arriving to murder every man, woman, and child who was in their territory. They were trying to establish their own state of deseret. And when a party of about 150 pioneers came through, they were surrounded by what appeared to be Native Americans, but they noticed every now and then they would see one that looked white, wearing Native American face paint. These were the Paiute tribe. It was mostly Paiute, but they were led by Mormons. And it's believed in some circles that Chief Kanosh recruited the Paiute from the Corn Creek area to participate in this raid, which killed 150 people who were attempting to surrender. Now, there's no evidence to suggest this other than the fact that in the 1850s, Kanosh did meet with Brigham Young during the Mormon War to discuss strategies and tactics that would be involved with defeating the U.S. military. Eventually, this conflict sort of fizzled out, and the U.S. welcomed the Mormons into their own territory, and there was another uneasy peace. But here Kanosh is buried as close as possible to his brother, but given a Christian burial. And on the 4th of September, he sent a note through a family member up to the Paiute leadership. We still don't know very well which Paiute band was involved, although some people theorize it could have been Kanosh. He sent a letter up there, and by the 6th, he was riding up north to Mountain Meadows. On the 7th, he was one of the first leaders of the militia to arrive there, and by the 8th, everybody else was funneling in, and so he was just the first man they saw. Although he was supposedly close enough to the fighting on the 7th that bullets went through his hat and shirt. And so it would have been blatantly obvious to the people in this wagon train that Mormons had allied with the Native Americans and were using them as a tool of war. Now, by the time everybody had assembled and a day had passed, it was the 9th, and they realized that the Paiute alone would not be able to pull this off. They wouldn't be able to wipe out the wagon train. So, Isaac Height issued, or rather William H. Dame issued an order that was ambiguous enough to absolve the upper leadership of the Mormon militia of any complicity in this. And understand that the structure of this local militia was William H. Dame, 4 battalions, and only the 4th one was headed by John D. Lee. So he was just somebody who was in charge of a local level battalion. He wasn't in charge of making these orders. And he claims that on the 10th there was a meeting and they were deciding what to do. And he claims he was the only one who objected to joining in the massacre and killing all of the immigrants under the flag of truce. Now, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he probably did not do this. A lot of evidence to say that he probably was on board with the massacre. But regardless of this, we know for a fact that on the morning of the 11th, he was sent into their wagon train under a white flag, and he said, "We've negotiated terms of surrender, you need to turn over your weapons." Now, normally, the Arkansas train would not have turned over their weapons. However, they were dying of thirst. They had no water, and they had a bunch of young children. So they said, "Yes, we'll do this." And so quickly, everybody took their positions. They sent off one wagon train full of wounded and elderly, one full of the women, and then the children under 7 went in a different direction. And somebody appeared on top of a hill and said, "Do your duty," which was the signal to begin the massacre. And the massacre, I think one of the most eerie facts of all of this, is that the massacre of September 11th, 1857, happened incredibly fast. They began shooting immediately. They had guns basically trained on all of their heads, and then anybody who survived, they were clobbed over the head, and then their throats were cut. And John D. Lee was accused of this many years later. He went down to far south Utah-Arizona border to start a farm at the Lonely Dell Ranch. He tried to be as far away from civilization, but they drug him out. Now, for years, the LDS Church, and Brigham Young especially, he said that anybody who believes the Mormons were involved in this will die a dog's death and be damned and go to hell. Those were his words. Now, later they admitted that John D. Lee did it, and the official narrative was that he was the one that was responsible. However, most of the upper-level command got off scot-free. They were involved with local community politics, they were local bishops, they were elected, they were community leaders, businessmen, doctors, lawyers, and a lot of the people who were the clubbers and the killers, they later went insane. John D. Lee wrote an expose on it, and he was, many people think, executed basically as a sacrificial lamb so that the government would not come down on Brigham Young as a whole, and that the Mormons would not be killed as a whole. Of all of the perpetrators of Mountain Meadows Massacre, we know very little about the majority of them. And William S. Hawley is one of those men that we don't really know what he did on September 11th, of the day of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. But lore started to begin around William S. Hawley in his later years, and it was quadruple hearsay. He told a relative who told a friend who told a friend, and apparently William S. Hawley objected to the killing of the women and children at the massacre, and for that apparently somebody had chained him to the tire of a wagon and made him watch the massacre unfold. And it's said that in his later years he either died totally insane or was simply just a little bit off, but he never was the same after the massacre. Years after the Mountain Meadows Massacre, John D. Lee in 1871 moved out here to the Lonely Dell Ranch, and he opened up Lee's Ferry. Now, both of these now are nationally protected sites, but it's important to note that Mormons, especially John D. Lee, Jacob Hamlin, and other people who settled in far south Arizona, felt a need to proselytize to the Native Americans. They considered them a lost tribe of Israel, the Lamanites. So he came out here to what is now the Navajo Reservation and decided to open up this ranch. And here he had over a dozen wives, and there's still structures on the property, such as this building here, that belonged to polygamists as early as the 1920s. And John D. Lee stayed here from 1871 to 1877. Now, during that time, most of his wives left him, and even though there was a general amnesty granted to the people who took part in Mountain Meadows, it was 20 years after the massacre that John D. Lee himself was taken and executed at the massacre site. Now, it's interesting to note here that I believe because of his interest in joining with the Native Americans, when they said, "Let us team up with the Paiutes for this massacre," it was his desire to join forces with the Paiute, which I believe motivated him. Now, the Paiute believed, as I had already talked about with the death of the child and a couple of other Paiutes near Corn Creek with Chief Kanosh's band, they believed that these immigrants were coming down and spoiling the relationship that Jacob Hamlin had cultivated slowly with the Navajo and the Paiute, because these pioneers were poisoning the wells. At least that's what they thought. It was just anthrax. Now, probably John D. Lee and other members of the Iron County Mormon militia believed that it was their job to team up with the Native Americans. And this is why he settled here in Navajo country, because at the time, a lot of the Navajo really respected Jacob Hamblin, John D. Lee, and other Mormon missionaries in this part of the world. Before I leave, I wanted to talk about the supposed discovery, and I believe 2002, of a couple of lead plates. Now, John D. Lee, in his memoirs, wrote that Brigham Young never ordered him to commit this massacre, but it was committed in general because of a war hysteria that was created by Brigham Young. He said essentially Brigham Young handed them the gun, didn't tell them to shoot, but they kind of understood the orders. But there were a couple of lead plates found here in 2002 which seemed to suggest that it was ordered directly by Brigham Young. As recently as 2006, the same guy who analyzed the Hoffman papers, and famous Mormon historian and document forger, was analyzing these plates, and as far as I understand, John D. Lee, his signature is written in a way that he didn't actually write it, so they seem to be forgeries, but they were really well-made forgeries. And here are the ruins of John D. Lee's old fort. He built it in the 1870s to protect Lee's Ferry from Navajo raids, because although he had good relations with the Navajo, you could never be too careful against marauding bands, which were pretty active for quite a while. I should clarify, actually, this is Lee's Fort, established to protect Lee's Ferry, and that is the site of the American Placer Corporation. And the last service across this river, because you needed a ferry boat to get across, was in the 1920s. The Placer Corporation, actually, it went defunct in 1910, but this is the Colorado River, deep in a remote canyon. I think John D. Lee, after the massacre, wanted nothing more than to get away and be as secluded as possible. A lot of men died insane after this. They lost their minds with guilt.